Any questions or anything before we get going? If it's not obvious, then let me say that coming to class is really a good idea. It's in part because, well, this should be obvious, but you don't really. And one reason for that is that the classes have a narrative continuity, right? They're not like, first we do this, and then we do this, and you think, well, I'm just going to leave out the odd numbers. I'll do the even ones. You can't really do that, right? Because the thread keeps getting woven back into other things. Okay, so last time we were looking at Aristotle on selfishness or self-interest, and of the easily overlooked but immensely important issue when we talk about self-interest, of being clear what the self is, whose interest we were talking about. And we have this very clearly, right? If we think of self-love, for example, so we think of love this way, right? It's not the only way, but it's a useful way to think of it. That loving someone is wanting the good for them, for their own sake, something like that. And if you think about self-love, then that's wanting the good for yourself, for your own sake. And that instantly raises the question of what your good is. And merely wanting some stuff and thinking, oh, you know, I'm going to get that, and if I get that, that's going to be an example of self-love. Well, that depends a lot on whether what you get is good for you. And what Aristotle points out is this: when we say somebody is too much of a self-lover, or they're too self-interested, or they're selfish, right, those kinds of things, there's an ambiguity involved, because it all depends on which self we're looking at when we make the judgment. So if we think of people who are out for appetitive goods, Aristotle calls these the goods of competition, or the fought-over goods, the parimachita, the things that people compete for, right? So they're scarce, and so we tend to run into one another when we want them. And he says, yeah, when people want too many of those, we say they're selfish for those goods. Those are the things they want for themselves. And then to call somebody a self-lover or self-interested or selfish is to criticize them, right? But if instead we were looking at someone who wanted to gratify, right, the rational part of themselves, the result would be that what they wanted was more of things like virtuous actions. They wanted more of the things that they thought were much more valuable than those other goods. And he says, nobody would object to that. I mean, imagine somebody who who competed with you to do more justice than you did, or who competed with you to be more temperate, right? Nobody would worry about that. Why? Well, because these are precisely the goods that we want other people to have, right? So this is something that's crucial, right? When we look at other people, we want them to be virtuous and good and moral and upright and just and so forth. It's only when it comes to ourselves that we tend to think like, but could I get away with it, right? Right? We don't think that you should do that, right? You should be good, right? It's me, right? Maybe I should get a little more by cheating. And what Aristotle points out, and I think that this is going to turn out to be a central notion. So when we look at certain kinds of goods, we see the good of them right away. So these are the kind of obvious goods, the ones that we typically mention when we want to get across some ideas about good. So high on the list for everyone is pleasure. Just as high on the list of very obviously bad things is pain. Right? And we get those across easily. Then when we come to other things, so think of beauty and music, a good example. So it turns out that we have a fairly native appreciation of certain kinds of harmonies. We do for other things as well. It's not hard to learn how to appreciate them. They sound good, right? So play a little Mozart for children, babies, and even cows give more milk if you play the right kind of music, right? So it's not like you need to be Mahler or Wagner or something to appreciate those. But then there's other kind of music which it takes quite a lot of learning to appreciate. And this is true for all of the arts. So think of ethics that way. Think of it for a moment as like aesthetics. And what Aristotle was saying is, if you really got to see these goods, right, justice, temperance, and so on, you would see that they're actually better goods than the appetitive goods that you have no trouble seeing the good of. And that's very much like what Plato says, except that Plato tries to cash it out in terms of pleasure. And he says, if you really saw what justice is, you would see that the pleasures of being just are more pleasant than the appetitive pleasures that you have no trouble seeing the pleasure. So that's the thought, and it's a bit like this, right? I know you like Harry Potter books. Who doesn't? But if you get to be a more experienced reader, you'll like George Eliot or Jane Austen better. And if you get to be even more experienced, maybe you like Proust better than them, and so on, right? And the thought is, look, I'm telling you something about where you are now and where you could be in terms of appreciating value. You're here, you could be here. I used to be there, now I'm here. I'm telling you, advising you, right? So there's an element, and it's unavoidable in any area of value, it seems to me, where there's sort of an issue of trust. Right? Do you trust me to, because you're going to have to put in some labor, right? Of those, to see the values that I see, that's going to take some work. Well, work is work. And that means you could turn out to be wasting your time, right? There's a risk in life that you'll buy the wrong stock. And there is no way to avoid it. You're going to buy some stock anyway. Whether you set out to buy it or you just sit back and do nothing, that's buying stock too. And it'll either pay off or it won't. And so the question is, right, who should you trust? Who's to be a good advisor? And that issue comes up across the board. And what Plato and Aristotle both say is, well, the really good advisor would be, first of all, think about what a good judge is, right? So someone who is not distracted by his own concerns or her own concerns, but is sort of equipoise, able to measure things properly, that would be good. And what about a broad understanding of the world and the way it works? Yeah, that'd be good. Right, you kind of try to build it that way. And you say, well, if there was a person like this, right, the philosopher king or the Framos, the person of practical wisdom, they would be the one, they'd be the ones to listen to. But notice that there is an element of trust, right? The thought is, will you see what I see? Right? You go through the learning process, but will you see what I see? So we're experienced this across the board in education. Right? So when you go to school, they make you take a whole lot of courses. And then courses become discretionary, right? You get to make some choices. And you make some bad choices, right? You take some courses you wish you hadn't taken, right? You have to taste them, right? You have to see what it's like in order to know whether you're going to want to go on or not. And you're making a bet, right? And maybe it's just unfortunate. Maybe it came at the wrong time. Maybe the teacher was a bad teacher for you, right? All those kinds of things feed into the question of whether or not you'll have made wise and good choices in developing your own capacities to experience the world of values. So that's the right way to see it from Plato and Aristotle's point of view. What you really want, right, is to see the world of values as it is, and then a certain amount of selection is permitted. So if we look at the world of values, and we don't come out with any sort of prejudices about which ones are more important. You know, we're not already doing ethics or morality or anything. We're just looking at what are the things that are valuable. So we've got the world of values. And then we've got the easily accessible ones. And those are ones that even a neonate, right, even a newborn can experience, right? The newborns come into the world already primed to experience some things as positive values and some as negative pleasures and pains, being held, being suckled, and so forth. All of those you can see they like, and right, they make it clear that they don't like others. And then as we move out this way, right, we get to the less accessible. Now that's what the world of values sort of looks like, right? It's a world of increasing access. And because, right, in order to access more and more values, you have to put in work. That is, you have to do things that already have value or disvalue for you, right? You've got to spend money, right? You've got to put in hours and time. You've got to undergo stresses and strains. You've got to labor and sweat. All of these things are costs. And you incur costs to move out in this direction. Okay, so now suppose you get to here, to point X. So you've done all the work. And you get now to taste X under the conditions under which X can be tasted. So think of it this way, right? I give you a little, you're doing some physics. I tell you this is one of the most beautiful pieces of physics that there is, but in order to fully see it, you've got to learn a little bit of tensor calculus, hard, right? You put in the effort, you learn the tensor calculus, a little bit of, and then you're ready. And you look at it and you think, right? Yeah, and I sort of see how somebody would think that was really cool, but it just sort of leaves me cold. I didn't do anything for me, as we said. Now, when we move out to X, right, we may move out to what I want to call discretionary value. And what I mean by that is, if you don't value X, hey, it's not the end of the world, right? There's a lot of stuff to value. So take way back here. So not X, but Y. So Y is just on the cusp of the easily accessible, and that might be vanilla or chocolate. And of course, if that's what it is, right, that's a key example of discretionary value, right? You don't have to like either. But if you like one and not the other, nobody is going to think, oh, there's something wrong with you, and as regards your capacity to appreciate value. Suppose we get to X, and I'll take an obvious one would be the music of Richard Wagner. Also, there's a real controversy about Wagner. So some people think Wagner is just the greatest composer ever, and they think, well, never has been and never will be anything like the Ring, right? And there are other people who just think it's despicable. It's degenerate, ghastly, awful music. And I'm sure you've run into this with whatever music you like. Somebody else thinks it's noise or awful. But that's discretionary, right? Even if I put you in, so I say, look, that's just because you don't know enough about music. Let me give you course in music appreciation. I'll play the right things in the right way to get you to be able to see what's really going on in Wagner. Suppose I do all that, and you really do give yourself over to it. You know, you're not, as often as the case, you're not already disengaged from the process. Right? You really do give it the benefit of the doubt. You put a lot of time and effort into it. And now I say, now if you don't like it, you're in a position to just make that judgment. You're not an idiot anymore. You're not too uncultivated or unknowledgeable of music to make the judgment. Wagner is just not for you. And then you join a group of some people are very discriminating listeners to music who just don't like Wagner. And that's okay. You don't have to like Wagner. Right? So that's a discretionary value. And you can pick whatever you want. Same with painters, and poets, and writers. There's a huge discretionary realm. If you didn't value any music, if you didn't think any of it was any good, right? And you weren't defective, as my maternal grandmother was. My grandfather was a musician, so my grandmother played everything to the tune of my music, my Mary of the Curling Hair. She couldn't discriminate one tune from another. So You could be tone deaf, as you can be colorblind, right? And then really you just can't, you don't have the perceptual apparatus, right, to get into music. But that aside, if you're not disabled with respect to learning how to appreciate music, but you don't appreciate any of it, then you are defective with respect to the world of values, right? You're failing to value in an area where you should value something, even if not everything, right? And the same with the whole set. We could argue about that, but that's a good place to go. Now, out here, too, though, there are going to be a point C, and I don't know where it is. It might be closer to the accessible. That's a question. And this is non-discretionary. That is, it's not okay not to value them. And what that means is you can be subject to criticism, maybe even to punishment for failure to value. So there, somewhere out here, there's Z. It's a kind of value. It might be close to here. It might be anywhere. I'm not situating it where it's non-discretionary. It's not up to you whether you value it. You're supposed to value it. And if you don't value it, you become subject to judgments of value. Right? So this is often where people put moral. So moral value, this gets put into non-discretion. Okay? The thought is if you don't value justice or telling the truth or disvalue lying, there's something the matter with you. Right? And you can be blamed for it and punished for it. Whereas, if you don't like Wagner, you don't get blamed or punished for that, right? Unless by rabid Wagnerians who don't matter, right? Okay, so that's the thought. Now, when we get here, right, think of this as requiring effort from you. But there's also something else, right? So if I say, okay, you're in the best position to make the judgment. Now, you're not defective with respect to your perceptual apparatus. You're ready. If you don't like it now, it's okay not to like it. That's just about you and what you value, and we're allowed to differ. Other cases, when I get out here and you fail to see it, you're subject to blame. Right? That's the thought. Okay. So in this case, what can be true is you can't appreciate the intrinsic value of this. You need to be given incentives to do what's there because you can't see it. We'll reward you and punish you with values you can access in order to get you to do it. So again, think of Matthew. So what's so great about being meek? I'll tell you what's so great about being meek. You really get shafted if you don't be meek. And you get shafted in terms that you understand. Easily accessible shafting is what you get, right? You're not going to think, is this really punishment? Maybe this is. No, you'll know, right? That's the thought. Okay, so that's where we are. So notice though that as we move out in this direction, as we're moving this way, out to less and less readily accessible value, an issue of authority. Instantly emerges, right? As you're going to have to buy a pig in a poke. That's what you're doing, right? You're going to spend things you already value in order to buy something or get something that you don't know will be valuable to you. So you put in all that effort to appreciate Wagner and you just don't like it. In a way, you've wasted your time, right? And a lot of, I think, thoughts we can have about our education in high school and so on is that a lot of it really was a waste of time, right? It doesn't make our lives richer, doesn't make us better able to do anything. It's just stuff they made us do. And we quickly forgot it. And then there's other stuff, you're lucky, that you don't feel that way, right? That's the thought. So getting an education in values is a program like this, right? The goal is, have you learned have you acquired really valuable stuff? Stuff that could be valuable for other things you want, that's one kind, or it could be intrinsically valuable, stuff you want for its own sake, right? It could be either one of those. If it's neither one of those, then you have wasted your life. Yeah.
So I'm kind of confused as to how this works in terms of virtues, because like if we say like well-being is a non-discretionary value, then virtues could be the proper way to respond to certain aspects of life, such that they will be conducive to one's well-being.
Yeah.
So it seems like it's hard to see how there could be any like argument about well-being being a non-discretionary value.
Well, but you know, your well-being might be down here in terms of readily accessible values, or it might be out here. So the thought would be, well-being too is something that comes in qualitatively distinguished bits, right? So if all you ever manage to appreciate are repetitive pleasures or easily accessible pleasures, but you get a lot of them, you know, you're in the well-being stakes. You're not a loser completely. You're not a winner either. But you're not doing so bad. In your terms, you may, like the money lovers in the Republic, you may think you're doing fine. This is what I want and I'm getting it. There's better things to want, but you don't want them or they're inaccessible to you, right? So then the thought is, yeah, you really do, you know, we're gonna require of you that you at least extrinsically value the non-discretionary values, right? We're gonna require that. And that may or may not pay you direct dividends in happiness. Intrinsically, it may only pay you in terms of you avoid pain and you get rewards and you don't get punishment. Now, just to be clear, right? Just that little story I told you says about moral values. It says there are two kinds of ways to value them, and two kinds of broad categories, two kinds of moral agents. There are people like the Phronimos and the philosopher king, the man of practical person, practical wisdom, and the philosopher king, who see the intrinsic value of moral values. They see what's good about them, so much so that, as Aristotle says, they'll sacrifice non-moral values for moral values. So here's the little story he imagines. So suppose we're in competition for some, right, non-moral values, right? So there's a prize, right? I actually want you to win them. Why? Well, because then I get the prize for generosity, and generosity is much more valuable than what you get, right? So now it could look this way, right? You see, I'm selfish after all, right? Because I want the really important stuff. I'm happy to let you have the other stuff, right? And that's actually raises some little puzzles for Aristotle of the kind of, you know, you get two just people competing to see who is more just, right? But leave that aside, that's the way it goes. When I'm good, I get better value than anything I sacrifice in order to be good. So when I give away stuff to be generous, right, I'm getting better than what I give because I'm getting rewarded in terms of virtue and so forth. That's more valuable. Now, Aristotle thinks there are two kinds of people, as Plato does, right? Well, there are those who just can't see that. They think that's crazy. Anybody who just gives money away and thinks that they're getting something better, that's just crazy. Unless they think they're getting brownie points in heaven, which means they'll get more money, you know, sort of later. Unless it's an investment, you just don't see what the payoffs are yet. Unless it's that, they're stupid. All right? They just don't see that actually all that ethical stuff is just noise, empty stuff. They rightly see that only competitive values and money and so on, and success and power, those are the only things that really matter. The rest is just smoke. The others say, no, it's you who's deluded. You just don't see the value of something that actually is more valuable. Now, so if we tell this kind of story, right, we get two kinds of moral agents. That is, people who will do moral actions. And that's why I say agents. They'll do moral actions. Those who do them because they're intrinsically worth doing, and those who do them to get rewarded and avoid getting punished. There are two kinds, right? And there's as Plato says on the Crito, which you he says, there's a great gulf set between those two people. They really just don't understand each other, right? Why? Well, because one always recommends values that are down here, right? Accessible, yes, inaccessible, sure, but no non-discretionary ones. They don't recognize those. They just think, no, the only reason to do those things is to benefit from down in here, right? They don't have any intrinsic value. Yeah. So you get two kinds of moral agents. And what we'll see when we get to Kant is Kant think that's an unreasonable position to hold. Right? He's going to say, no, there's only one kind of moral agent. And then the question is, how is he going to get that across? So let's go back for a moment to the question of authority. Right? So take the authority in an obvious place first in the Gospel of Matthew. So it's easiest, the reason I picked those two things to start with is it's fairly obvious, much more obvious, where the oomph is coming from, so to speak. And in the Gospel of Matthew, you could say, where is the authority coming from? Why should I do any of these things? Where is that coming from? And the answer is, right, God understands better the world of values, right, recommends certain values to us, and gives us an incentive to value them. We, in some cases, we might have some dim perception of why those things are intrinsically valuable, right? So in the case of justice, maybe, or lying, or killing, we might think, oh yeah, I see, right? But others, weave your coat of two threads, don't do that, don't eat rock badger. There, I don't see. And what you might say, God is the grown-up who says, I see the whole world of value, you don't. Let me tell you in a particular sort of way what to do, and let me give you an incentive. If you don't do it, I'll punish you. If you do it, I'll reward you. So all the authority there is the authority of superior knowledge and superior power. And remember what Plato says in the Republic, until power and knowledge thoroughly digest one another, that is, until the powerful are knowledgeable and the knowledgeable have power, there'll be no human happiness, right? No guarantee of it. Right? You need two things to come together. Those two questions are tied together. Right? In authority, it's got to be not just cognitive authority, but it's got to have an incentive, right? Something that gets you to follow what knowledge tells you, and that's the power of punishment or reward you. Okay? You with me? Okay. So, right, those two things are things to have in mind. When we think about authority, think about those two things, right? And in the case of God, it's fairly obvious. And then you might think that the Phronimos and the Philosopher King are kind of human models of that superior knowledge and power, with two different pictures on Plato's sort of scientific mathematical knowledge as what you need, on Aristotle's view. No, it's more the kind of knowledge you get by living and having lived a perception. You know, being aware of life and making good judgments about it and keeping track of how people live and what they do. Much more empirical. You get all that stuff together with power, you've got the kind of authority morality has for some. So notice, for God, the authority of the values is their intrinsic value. He responds to the intrinsic value of goodness because it's good. There's nobody threatening him with punishments or rewards. For him, virtue is its own reward. So be ye perfect as our Heavenly Father is perfect in Matthew. that can come across as, right, a challenge to the picture of Matthew that we were constructing, right? It says, no, because remember, God is not perfect to avoid punishment or to get rewards. He's more like Job. He's good for goodness' sake. But we leave that. So when we look at the authority and power of, so let me just, of God as an example, we get knowledge and power. But when we ask, what's the authority of value for God, we don't need the power. Right? So here's the authority that God has in the world of values. Now when we ask, for God, right, what is? It can't be the same story. God responds to the world of values. He sees this is good, and he does it. He doesn't need an incentive, a further incentive to do it. He just does it because it's good. And in that way, that just like the philosopher king and the chronos, they do the virtuous thing because they see the good, right? They don't need a further incentive in terms of other values to do it because it itself provides the incentive. Let me stop there to make sure we've got it, because that's really crucial. So think of it this way. When I ask, why should I be good? Why should I do this moral thing? What would it take to incentivize me? What would it take to motivate me to do it? Would it be enough that it was good? Then power doesn't come into it, right? It wouldn't be enough. Then somebody's got to be able to make me pay or reward me, right? That's the crucial distinction. So in ethics, as in all issues of value, there's first, what are going to be your intrinsic values? And there have to be some, because if no value is intrinsic, no value is extrinsic either. Extrinsic values are values because they promote intrinsic values. Take out the intrinsic values, there isn't anything to value. Okay? So when we pick our class of intrinsic values, we're also picking the structure of the world of value, because everything will be made to be valuable in terms of our intrinsic values. The appetitive person thinks they're all down here. Right? The moral person thinks, no, even the moral values can be intrinsic. Right, they're out there. With me? Good, okay. Now, yes.
Well, I was kind of wondering, because both Aristotle and Plato seem to end up in a similar place regarding things that are, they end up saying something like, there's not really things that are good for you that are really bad for other people. Like, that's maybe reciprocal, but the basic idea is that like other people's suffering isn't good for you. It just seems like that way until you're knowledgeable enough. So social goods and individual goods are always going to line up pretty well.
Yeah, remember the closing sentence of chapter 2 of book 1 is the good for a city and the good for a human being are the same. A good for a political good and individual good are the same, or social good and individual good are the same, but one is nobler and more godlike, the social good. Yeah, so the thought here is, when I see what the intrinsic goods are, will they include the goods of other people? Right, so imagine that there's a whole, so we can do it this way, right? Here's a way I'll use a different color here. So in here, somewhere in the realm of values, right, there are what we call the sort of egoistic goods. That is, those are the ones that are good for the agent. And then there are some others. The non-egoistic goods. Those are, or as we might say, the social goods. Goods of others. Right? And so the question might be this, right? Are all and only the intrinsic goods in here? Or are all and only the intrinsic goods in here? Or are intrinsic goods in both realms? So, right, both Plato and Aristotle are, in one way, they think the only things that can motivate me are egoistic goods. Right? Oh, so in that sense. But now they have a, right, so that's the first step. Right? And so in that sense, they're both egoists. Both Plato and Aristotle are egoists. They think the only reason to do anything is because it's good for you. But notice that they're quite, at the next step, what things are good for you? They're quite broad in their conception of what things are good for you. So let's do this, let's do the math on this, so to speak, over here. I think that's what we're going to do it. So we're going to do it in black and green to kind of color code our drawing. So that's picking up on the black and green in the diagram. And here's the question, right? So here's a way to look at what's going on. So we're going to look at a motivational set. And we're going to look at it from the point of view of design. So this is the crucial step, right? So you can look at things in two ways, right? What should I do? I'm already an agent. Here I am. And the question is, what should I do now? What action should I do? Different question. What sort of an agent should I be? When we confront, as we are now, right, looking at ethical questions, we're already constituted or formed agents. But once upon a time we weren't. We have to be formed socially and educationally and in our families to be agents of a certain sort. So we adopt the design perspective. We're asking this question. If I were wholly motivated by my concerns about my own happiness, what kind of a motivational set would I have? What kind of motivational set would it be good for me to have? So one might think, oh, only the green one, only egoistic things, or only the black one, or some mixture of them, right? And what Plato and Aristotle are going to do is to say the green and the black actually blend together, right? So, and the way they're going to do it is by noticing that there are two kinds of egoistic desires. So we'll take egoistic. So inside the egoistic, there are the me desires and the non-me. And this is very important. So, right, we can think of it this way, right? When I think about egoism, I can think this way. The egoist acts to satisfy his own desires. Yeah, so you're an egoist, right? If you always satisfy your own desires. And a lot of people would think that's just what it is to be an egoist, right? You always act to satisfy your desires. Plato and Aristotle come back and say, yes, but there are two kinds of desires that can be yours. One are the me desires, and the other are the non-me desires. So let me give an example. Here's a me desire. I want that I have a new Maserati. I want that I have it. Another desire of mine, I want that you have it. They both can be mine, right? I can have desires about you, that you have things. And I can have desires about me, that I have things. And both of those are things that an agent can have. So if we make an egoist satisfy your own desires, and then we go up here, we can say, oh, you can be an egoist and satisfy your non-me desires, right? So here's my project. I want all of you to be happy. How am I going to get that? And I say, and you could turn around and notice people do this, and it's really stupid. You'll never do it, right? Once you hear it, it's gone forever, right? You know, Reeve, you know what he wants? He wants all of us to be happy. I really believe it. I'm sure that's what he wants. What a selfish bastard. He always acts to satisfy his own damn desires. You'd be crazy to say, right? Or you might say this, great, let's hope more people are selfish in that way, right? Right? So selfishness is not satisfying your desires. It's satisfying your me desires, right? Your non-me desires, right? So now the question is this: when I look at my motivational set, should I do this? Should I only have me desires? That's the crucial question. And here's the, well, what do you think? Suppose you were designing a motivational set for yourself. Ask this: would I, or for a child of yours, would I want only to put me desires in that motivational set? How would you give me an example of one that a non-me desire that you might want to put in? Well, for maybe you don't agree. Maybe you think, no, you should put only me desires in there. If you put only me desires in there, what you're saying is this: I should be motivated exclusively to satisfy my me desires. So of course I can satisfy desires of yours, but only if it satisfies my me desires, right? So I won't think this: I want you to be happy, full stop. I'll think, I want you to be happy because if you're happy, then you'll make me happy too. Yeah. Now it's me desires that are driving. So can you think of a reason why you might want to put a non-me desire? Yeah.
We're talking about like parents. For the survival of the human species, would probably want the parent to have a non-me desire for their children.
Now that, notice the way you put it, sounds like I could say this: who cares about the survival of the damn species, right? So, but you're right, of course. We should certainly hope that others have non-me desires, right? Because it's not clear that if our parents, if we were out me-desiring parents, it's not clear we bring up very successful children. But there's another factor which is very close to that, right? About something that we all want, that involves having non-me desires. What are the two great commandments in Matthew? Yeah, exactly. And those both talk about love, which is one of the things that people want in their lives. They want to be loved by others. And not just that, but they want to love others too. And that's wanting the good for them for its own sake, right? So insofar as you think, you know, it's good for people to love and be loved, you're thinking that it's good for them, right, to take out this and to put some non-me desires. So here's a non-me desire that we might all want to put in: love and be loved, the desire to love and be loved. And of course there are many others that are like that too, but let's just stick with that one, okay? So we think, you know, a person who doesn't end up loving anyone, or doesn't ever get any love, that's a deprived life. Nobody would want it. That's the thought. Suppose it's true. We could question, as we can question everything, but suppose it is true, right? So we want love and to be loved in our motivational set. Question: why do we want it in our motivational set? Well, I just told you, right? I said we put it in because. So tell me, why do we want it in there? if you build your motivational set from the eudaimonistic point of view, that is, aiming always only to put motives into it that will result in you being happy, you will end up with a motivational set that has lots of non-me desires in it. So this is a way that philosophers can put it. Second order egoism is compatible with first order altruism, right? And now the question would be, is there anything wrong with that? And I say, no. I say that's the best of all possible worlds. Why? Because it gets all the force of egoism behind the altruistic stuff. It builds altruism on an egoistic foundation on the grounds that that's the strongest. Love your neighbor as yourself, says, right? Right. Build the here's the way to read it. It's David's version, right? This is the way to read it, right? Build your love of your neighbor on the same foundation as your love of yourself, right? Build, base it on, ground it in your love of yourself. That says, build a motivational set that has concern for the welfare of others in it. Why? Because that's the way to love yourself. Next step would be to explain the theological commandment, but I won't. So now that we've set all that up, we're ready to look out. Yeah, go ahead.
I wonder why Plato and Aristotle seem so confident that when there's a conflict between me and non-me desires, if the me desires are always going to be these competitive things, as opposed to there actually being a real conflict where both of them, where the me desires might actually be towards my well-being and the non-me desires might actually be wrong.
Yeah, so good. So first I think we want to be careful in building our intrinsic values that we aren't narrow-minded about, right? So, but most people are like Thrasymachus and Glaucon and Adamandus, right? They think, well, we know what's valuable, and it's, money, power, sex, drink, food, those kind of stuff. That's all valuable. And they narrow their gaze on those. So we don't have to do that, right? But usually in debate, right, you should start with the uncontroversial ones, the ones that everyone accepts, and then see how far you can go with those. Because of course, debates about intrinsic values tend to be boring. I like vanilla, I like chocolate. Let me try that again. I like vanilla. I like chocolate. And it goes on like that, right? So it's very difficult. The only way to do it is to escape from the present bounds of the argument and say, let me try to get you into a position to appreciate the value that I appreciate, right? And then that's a different thing. I might say, I know you like chocolate, but have you tried vanilla? Right? Haagen-Dazs vanilla. Have you tried Haagen-Dazs vanilla? Let me try that on you and see how you like it. And what is it about the chocolate you like? Is it that it's not as sweet as the vanilla? And I keep asking, right? I'm trying to get you, educate your palate so that I find a vanilla where at least you're beginning to say, it's not bad. Really, I didn't think I'd ever like a vanilla. I don't do that. And okay, now we might get somewhere, but we're not going to get anywhere by shouting at each other. That's why you really have to start with the uncontroversial intrinsic values. Now, suppose it is true. Let's take a case where there is a conflict. So I've got a motivational set that has me and non-me desires on it, and we see why I have them. But there's a conflict between a me desire and a non-me desire that arises. Right? So now we've got two thoughts we can have, right? Is that we must always know the answer to which one should trump. So that would be to say, when there are conflicts between doing well by others and doing well by yourself, at the first order, right? You should do well by yourself. Right? That would be to say, always settle disputes in your own favor. Another would be, always settle them in other people's favor. And a third would be, don't try to settle that in the abstract. Right? Conflicts come about not intrinsic to the motivational self, but because of the way the world is. You should wait and see what you should do. Sometimes you should settle for yourself. So sometimes what people do in this case is they talk when there are conflicts, they talk about these things, they call them agent-centered. Prerogatives. So let me give a very simple example. So when there are conflicts, we allow a certain favoring of the self. Let me give a very simple example. So I've got a good motivational self. I really do have non-me desires. I'm motivated to do things for others for their own sake. I don't always have to be looking at incentives and things, right? Got all that. Now here's the case. There are two people drowning. One is my wife and one is somebody I don't know. They're equidistant from me, but I can only save one. Would I be blameworthy if instead of tossing a coin, I saved my wife? Hardly anybody would think so, right? They would just think, no, that's a case where it's okay to do what's in your interest, right? So that says agent-centered prerogatives allow for us to add weight to our own case in a lot of cases. There are others which are like this, right? So in order for me to, take an obvious kind of case. So suppose you're a really great pianist. In order to be a really great pianist, you have to devote almost all of your energies to playing the piano and practicing. It's a full-time job, right? Same with a great athlete, right? You really have to put all of your spare time into this. So you're investing an enormous amount of time in your own skill and its maintenance. And suppose someone said, actually you would greatly increase the general welfare if you didn't spend all that time practicing the piano or whatever it is, playing chess, doing mathematics, but you spent some of it working for Oxfam or whatever. That's a case of a real conflict, right, where how you should distribute your energies is as an appeal on you that pulls against the projects that are at the very center of your sense of who you are and what your life is about. And that's going to be true for anyone who has a project like that. And it'll be true of people who have much lesser and less demanding projects, right? And so if we said, you should always be sensitive to the needs of others, just as sensitive as you are to your own needs, nobody would ever develop any projects like that, right? Because in order to become really first rate at something, you have to allocate far more energy to it than you do to anything else. And so so a whole set of intrinsic values would disappear off the map if we weren't allowed to specialize in them, right? And that's a very important kind of case too. So that's where a whole set of issues about, which we'll see in some of, come up about just what kinds of, how loudly are we to hear all the demands on us of the values that are out there. So people are starving. That should make a huge demand on us. How big a demand? Well, suppose you were thinking that you'll go to see a movie. You're going to spend $7 on it. If you gave that to Oxfam, you'd really alleviate some misery. If we all did it, we alleviate a huge amount of misery. Where should that stop? As soon as you start that ball rolling, it's very hard to know where it will stop. So we had a famous case in the department, just to show you. Somebody's taking an ethics course, and they were studying this particular kind of question, and very influenced by it. And so, having worked all summer to earn money, they decided to give it all away to charity. Parents were furious. you were working also to earn the money to help support yourself through school next semester, and now you give it all away to, you think, no, they're both right, right? There are appeals on both sides, right? And if we thought of it that way, so how much of your money should you give to charity? Any? Some? How much? There are real conflicts, right? How much of your time? Time is money in one way, but of course not if you're Steve Jobs, right? Or used to be Steve Jobs, right? Right? Then you can think, no, I've got an awful lot of money, but a limited amount of time, right? So for me, it'll be much easier to give a few $1 billion. I'm hardly even going to notice it, right? Than it would be for me to give a few days of my time. So that's another place we can think of all these goods as kind of divided up, and then there will be conflicts. So my own approach here is to say, no, those conflicts should be approached on a case-by-case basis. We shouldn't try to think, but, right? And that's the way we do it, right? If your kid was run over by a car and was bleeding on the street, you know, you don't think, wait a minute, I just have to finish this little bit of work. And then it'll come and, right, that recalibrates your whole life, right, in the same way that a whole lot of other things, falling in love, can do, right? Suddenly you're looking at another direction altogether, and your life has taken on a different set of demands. And that happens when we have children, or when we find ourselves in politically hard times, and we have to devote more energies to politics than we did before, and so on. So I don't think there's a good way to abstractly do that. I think that people thinking about it have wanted to recognize the importance of both, and recognize that there are also really hard cases, and those have to be settled somewhat on their merits. So notice that, right, in the world of values, there are values that require, in order to be achieved and sustained, they require huge resources. And if we don't allocate the resources, they will disappear. And so we have to ask ourselves, are they worth it? So, you know, we try to preserve certain kinds of endangered species. That's very costly in some cases, especially to some people on whose land they happen to be, right? How do you deal with those? I think we want a rich world of values. We don't want it all. So there's a great line on one of Tom Stoppard's plays. A wife is talking to her philosopher husband, and she says, "Oh, you let reason settle everything." And he says, "My dear, if reason ruled the world would be one vast field of soybeans." It's an important thought to have in mind, right? But right, if we really drove some of these arguments, we'd end up with the field of soybeans if we weren't aware of the great set of values that we want to preserve. Let's look at the last last few chapters of the ethics. This is our last discussion of it, though of course we won't be leaving behind any of its themes. So it comes, I think, as a bit of a surprise when you get to, if you do, to book 10, 6 to 8 of the ethics. The last chapter suddenly starts talking about politics and about how important it is to have, you know, this all has to be integrated into politics. But if we look at 10.6a, it says, look, we shouldn't listen to the proverb writers and think human since you are human. But we should strain every nerve. We should do everything, panta poiene. We should do everything to realize the God in us, the divine thing in us. Because even though it's small in bulk, it's vastly more important. And that little, the God in us is our reason. So remember, when we looked at the Aristotelian self last time, right, we have the rational part. And the rational part divided into two, a rationally calculative part. And the scientific the two parts, and we left out this one. We talked about how this interacted with choice to produce action. We talked about deliberate choice. We talked about the role of the virtues in connection with all of this. We didn't talk about those. And this part is the one with which we know the truth. This is familiar from Plato. And it's also the part with which we contemplate. We theoreme, from which we get theory, of course. So here we are contemplating, and it's still hard to get across this without saying a lot more than we have time to get into. I want you to think this way. Think of contemplating, engaging in contemplation, as like what you do when you're focusedly listening to a piece of music. It's not this. It's not working out scientific theories. It's actually looking at the world from the point of view of the theory. So think about the way you look at the world when you look at it with understanding of what's happening out. In the way that when you look at a painting that you understand, right? You're looking at it in that way that grasps it intelligibly, right? That's the idea. It's the kind of engrossed, focused attention that you have to a piece of music that you love, what you've come to understand. And so as you listen to it, it's illuminated by your understanding. That's the thought. And in this case, right, what you're going to contemplate is not the world, but you've thought about, done science in the world, and now you see what the first principle or starting point of it all is. You see what the world exemplifies by way of its initial or first cause. So you see the world not just as a big pile of stuff happening, but you see it as something that came about from that. And that's God. But it's not Yahweh or the Judeo-Christian God or any other God that you are familiar with. Right? Aristotle thinks that well, when we contemplate in the best way, so that we see the world as fully intelligible because we see how it was caused, right? We're contemplating God, and God is, well, contemplation. Noesis. It's a grasp. Well, I'll give you the picture, right? Think about your self-consciousness. So you're aware of the room around you. Yes. Now think out of it. Get rid of the object of your awareness. Just remain aware, but not of anything. So that it's a bit like a light being on, right? So when you're unconscious, knocked out, something happens. When you're conscious, something happens. What's the difference? Well, think about it this way. When I put the light out in the room, it's dark. When I put the light on, it's bright. As yet, there may be nothing to see except the light. Now things come into the room and I see them. Think of consciousness as being like that. Okay? So when you're contemplating God, you're not contemplating some object. You're contemplating self-consciousness itself, manifesting self-consciousness itself. This is what the great mystics talk about, right? When you're wholly at one with the object of your contemplation, so you don't distinguish yourself from it. You're at one with it. You see just the light. There's no ego. There's no it. There's just the awareness. That's what it's all about. How's that? So the great mystics, right, of many different religious traditions talk that way. There's a state of consciousness you can work towards extremely hard to achieve, right? Where you're aware of just awareness of self. That, Aristotle says, is what happiness is. It's that blissful state of identification where you're not there and the object is. You don't have to believe. I'm just trying to give you the flavor of it, right? That's what he thinks it is. Yeah.
Didn't he say it's not a state? I thought he said it was an activity.
Wait, I missed that.
He said it wasn't a state. He said it was an activity.
Yeah, well, it's the state you're in when you're engaged in that activity. Yeah, you're right. That's not. But that's a technical little thing in Aristotle. This is just the active engagement of that. So when you're in that, engaged in that activity, that's what happiness is. You're right. He does say that. That's the right way to put it. That's what it is. Right? Now look, you don't have to worry about that. We're not, to get there and to see why he thinks it and why he has to think it, I can just tell you this. We've got no good theory of how self-consciousness gets into the world. We don't have one. Right? So David Chalmers taught contemporary philosopher, big on consciousness stuff, written a famous book called The Conscious Mind. Chalmers argues you've got to just think that self-consciousness gets put in the world as a primitive. There's no building it up out of other stuff. It's just like a fundamental aspect of reality. You can't make it out of anything. It's either there or it isn't. Suppose you thought that, then you'd be very close to Aristotle. You'd be thinking, right, self-consciousness, right, is not something that we get from any other things. It's just there. And now the thought would be, when I see that, I realize that somehow or other, it's fundamental. Well, here's the way to think about it, right? Think of pleasure. You thinking about it now? Right? Think about actually feeling it. Yeah? What it's like to be in a very pleasant state. Now click out the consciousness. Would it be worth having? No. Nothing, right? The fundamental requirement for any sort of value is that it be something that we can be consciously aware of. Take that out, and at least that's arguable, though, right? You get rid of the value too. So think of self-consciousness as the basic requirement for value. Without it, there would be nothing of any value at all. Right? So you could just go out, imagine, take anything you really like doing, suppose it's playing golf. Now imagine you doing it just like a zombie, right? You're wholly unaware of what you're doing. Would you still find it valuable? Would it still be valuable? Apparently not, right? We can just keep going like that. Anyway, this is just to give you the flavor. So Aristotle says we finally understand the way the world is, and we understand ourselves, and we understand what the core of all value is. Then this condition that the mystics talk about, we'll see as what our happiness really lies in. Now, I'm not suggesting you believe Aristotle. For one thing, I think you couldn't unless you actually had the experience yourself, right? You'd be like you'd be down here. You're being told that if you take all these steps, which requires a lot, you have to be in your 50s before you get into this stuff. Because you have to do a lot of science, just like with Plato. And then finally, you get to this moment where you understand fully the little story that I told you, but you see why it has to be true. And now you're in that state, and you understand that this is what it's all about. Right? Now, you can't take it, and Aristotle doesn't want you to. The last couple of sentences of 10:8 are, you have to apply this to your life, and if it fits, you should believe it, and if it isn't, you should dismiss it as mere words. So you should dismiss it as mere words, because for you, it doesn't apply, right? You're not busy spending your life contemplating or trying to get to that state, right? And so for you, when you apply it to your life, you're like, well, that's not what my life is all about, right? So you'll say, no, but the other one you could think is, but a very wise person, having thought a great deal about the world, has recommended that I try to get there, So maybe I should put a lot of time and effort and energy into seeing if I can get there. When you join a Zen monastery, if you do, thinking that eventually you'll become one of the elect and you'll be able to get to that beatific state, you're taking a chance and putting a lot of time and effort into a project that may or may not, may be like the Wagner project. It may be that you discover the best thing in life. Right? It's of the nature of the thing that there's a gamble involved. You can't just get it for free. Right? Okay, so that's the thought. Now here's all I want you to take away from it. Right? So at the end of the day, in Aristotle, as in Plato, right, as in Matthew, as in Job, a question of authority is raised that is alienating for us. Alienating in the following sense: we have to take somebody's word for it. We're not in a position to test it for ourselves. So compare, you know, I think this is the best chocolate ice cream I've ever had. I know you love chocolate ice cream. We taste it and see what you think. You taste it and you say, no, it's not nearly the best. Look, this one is much better. Right? You're not accepting anybody's word for it, right? You're running the taste test yourself, and you're making the decision. For you, this is the best one. End of story. For these cases, right, you have to accept somebody else's word for it. And that's the pressure point. The pressure point is, I'm not now acting autonomously and so forth. I'm in the position of a child listening to a greater authority tell me something, and moreover telling me that I can test it for myself. Right? I'm not in a position to test it for myself. So, right, now the next question would be, what would it take to be in that position? Well, it would take an awful lot of time, energy at work, and you probably wouldn't be in it until you were in your 50s. And that's a lot of demand, right, that I ask you to put on trust, right? Give me your life from now on till the next 30 years or so. Then we'll run the experiment, and you can then see for yourself whether you really like it or not. I would have thought it'd be, gee, 30 years from now I'm going to run the test and maybe I'll do this. Yuck. And where will my 30 years be then? Okay, so Kant will come to the rescue, or try to come to the rescue. He'll say, no, you need no authority but your own. You never have to accept anybody else's. I'm going to show you how to do it. So, next week.